to build your fibre network. Well, once you start to not want to use Chinese players, which cuts out ZTE and Huawei and smaller companies that are also involved in that, the only real scale player, I mean, UK authorities have said this, is Nokia.
Yeah.
I mean, the issue maybe they've got is that there are smaller companies that are starting now to become more visible, like Adtran, Calix, could become a bigger threat. But it's just been it's been the kind of engine of growth for them for the last sort of 2 or 3 quarters, I think.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, a second from our new studio, which we stress is a work in progress. Pierre has plans, don't you, Pierre?
Yes, I do.
What was that? Why did you have to adjust something?
My mic was off.
Right.
I mean, I think audio-wise...
staff.
I think audio-wise...
Yeah, that was different pressing buttons, to speak.
There's not much difference audio-wise from our audience.
Okay.
Visually,
No, I listened to the pod back last week. Nothing struck me as particularly different. Cool, we better crack on, because Pierre's in a hurry, so he made me turn up early, and here, an hour after I turned up, we finally started recording, so we'll just leave that there.
Good job you didn't bring up the reason, though.
Yeah. Pierre's been busy this afternoon. No, it's just an in-joke. We're making shit up about Pierre. All right, so what's going on? Nice day today.
It's bloody horrible.
Well, it was shitty earlier. It was nice when I was just walking in.
Here and I almost got blown into the road.
Oh, okay. It's all relative, isn't it? Compared to the sleet this morning, I had to drive my daughter into school in my pyjama bottoms. She was like, "Daddy, aren't you going to get changed?" I went, "Nah, we'll be all right." What are we going to talk about? So I'll crack on. I won't do too much preamble. I think it's worth mentioning. So at the end of last week, we chatted about the Spotify Rogan thing, which is obviously a subject close to my heart, not just because I like Joe Rogan, but because it touches on things like freedom of speech, who controls the public square, all these sort of broader societal matters, certainly as concerns the digital economy. And then I wrote a story, a follow-up story this week saying Spotify's concessions over Rogan failed to placate censors. Basically, Spotify shat itself a little bit and went, I tell you what, when Rogan bangs on about ivermectin or whatever, we'll stick on a little label that hyperlinks to people going ivermectin.
I saw him doing his little piece to Instagram about it. I thought he came across really well, actually.
I thought it's what he's like. He hasn't. My understanding of having watched hundreds of hours of him talking is he doesn't pick a team. He's interested in trying to get to the bottom of things. He's interested in open conversation. And the only reason, as I said on the pod last week, the only reason everyone's got the arsehole is because he's so popular.
But I liked the bit at the start of the Instagram thing where he sort of was on about distorting facts, and then he was like, "But how do we know what a fact? Because 2 years ago, what was being said about coronavirus is different now."
So this is what I was just going to lead up to in my story. It's one of those stories where I actually managed to get a nice lot of comments in the comments section. And, some of them were the usual trollish things, you don't know what you're talking about and all that sort of thing. But most of the people, and I'll say, worth a shout out is Andy Tiller, who's known within the telecoms industry. He's made some good points. There's some things I pushed back on. Like I accused him of making reductive majoritarian assertions.
Oh,
sounds a bit poncy, doesn't it?
Sounds very.
But that's because he kept reiterating that that scientific consensus is as good a marker of the truth as any, which is true to some extent. But what do you do with that statement? Does that mean that things that go against the scientific consensus are therefore verboten?
And also, I would say that this isn't like climate change, where 99% of the scientific community swung one way. It's much more split than that. Yeah, you had the whole Great Barrington Declaration had lots of very prominent people.
Well, exactly. I mean, which bit of the science are we talking about?
Exactly.
We know vaccines are good, but we also know these vaccines aren't as good as some other vaccines. So there's nuance everywhere. There's grey areas everywhere, and I'd say even with the climate stuff. Even if you accept the assertions of many of the climate modelers, and there are plenty of people like Bjorn Lomborg, Patrick Moore, tons of other fairly qualified people who do push back.
Yep.
So I'm not sure I'm necessarily convinced by this 99% thing. But the key thing for me isn't even so much what is consensus, is what does establishing consensus confer on everyone else? So if it's consensus... No, this isn't a segment. This is just preamble. But I'll make it as quick as possible. So if, for example, it was consensus that the shirt you've chosen to wear today was
Makes me look like Ray LeMaitre.
makes you look like Ray. Yeah, he hasn't complained about that segment last week. Makes you look like cross between Ray and some kind of Aztec.
Yeah.
If the consensus is hostile to your shirt, does that mean you're not allowed to wear your shirt? That's my point. What power does consensus confer? And then you get into things like tyranny of the majority, which John Stuart Mill wrote about in On Liberty, and all sorts of things like that. So anyway, I'm not going to read them out. Some people just made fools of themselves, and I just had to slap them down. But I'd say Andy especially, but a few others. I've got to give a shout out to one commenter. He won't listen to the pod, but I'm going to give a shout out to him anyway, called Mojo Rojo, because he knows who he is. But Andy sort of argued in good faith, and there's to and fro. And to be honest, that confirms to me another point in favour of freedom of speech. These things need to be out in the public domain. People need to be arguing the toss. It needs to go to and fro. Maybe we meet in the middle. Maybe we agree to differ, whatever. But if you ban one point of view, then you don't get a discussion at all. So that's one of the many reasons why I'm anti-censorship. And furthermore, as a journalist, all journalists should be anti-censorship, and it appalls me how many of them are in favour of it. For example, the amount of people coming out wanting to censor Rogan. But then, as I think I touched on last week, part of that is because Rogan's got a bigger audience than them and they're just butthurt. So I think that was an interesting thing. Ian, were you saying that you got a little bit of like...
Well, we can do that in the actual thing.
Oh, okay, fine. All right, well, we'll get into it because we
topics.
don't have a ton of time then. I'll just do the little bit I always forget first, which is if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, the latter of which it seems you're increasingly unlikely to do. You can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, if the censors allow you, right on, or loads of other podcasting platforms. Right, what are we going to chat about this week? Well, we're in the middle of quarterly season, aren't we? So we're going to talk about some quarterlies. We're going to start off by talking about Nokia, because it's only fair. We did Ericsson's quarterlies before. And also these quarterlies are the Q4 ones, which are also the full sort of year ones. Full calendar year at least.
And they've been sort of in their turnover year.
Yeah. So there's various angles and stuff to cover on that. Then I'm going to get into something that I know you covered, and you chatted to me about it before, but you actually wrote it up this week, which is a thing called X2.
What did it do with the X-Men films?
Yes, it's a sequel. Yet another sequel. Which is to do with how cell towers communicate with each other. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that has taken on new significance in the era of Open RAN. Mm-hmm. And you've written that up, and that looks really interesting. I just skimmed it on the train on the way in, so I'm largely in your hands. But then I can be the what's that all about then, bloke, as I so often am. And then I think we're going to finish off with more quarterlies, but we're going to look at US big tech. We're going to look at the hyperscalers, and we're going to look, as alluded to earlier, at Facebook, who've had a nightmare. And we'll work out why. Mm-hmm. And then that'll probably be it. Cool. Right. So Nokia, why don't you head off, Ian? What's going on with Nokia's quarterlies?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting year for them because it's been just over a year since they got their new CEO. I think it's August 2020, actually, he joined. Pekka Lundmark. Took over at a kind of low point for the company, I guess, when things...
When their Pekka was down.
Yeah, things haven't been going well under Rajiv Suri, who's now... Is he in Inmarsat or something?
I believe
now?
so, he's at a SAT.
Yeah, and so he's quite quick to sort of announce his restructuring plan, I guess. The important thing was to sort of address profitability, which was like, it's very, very similar actually in a way to the Ericsson story.
Yeah, Ekholm's job.
Yeah. And so he's had over a year in the job now, and I was on a call with him on, was it yesterday only? Yeah, it was. Wow. Okay. Yesterday morning, very early, did his call with journalists, and his big sort of message was, we've done the reset now. Now it's time to accelerate. That's the next phase in the strategy. Mm-hmm. And so on a positive note, I'd say if you look at the results, as I say, one of the problems for them was profitability, which had kind of suffered and there's a big margin improvement.
And we've gone over that
in the last year.
profitability. They kind of botched 5G there, the FPGA thing, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly that. I think they were quite quite a sort of bloated organisation as well. I mean, a lot of the restructuring is actually about headcount reductions.
Right. Which is funny because, I mean, Nokia's obviously gone through many reductions in terms of shedding business units.
Yeah.
So it shed the sat-nav bit to here. It shed the devices bit to Microsoft.
Yeah.
So you would have thought it had streamlined a fair bit, but obviously the networks thing was still few too many fins.
They had the big merger with Alcatel-Lucent in 2016,
and I think
you never really saw
there.
the employee numbers go down very much after that.
Right.
And you felt there was. I mean, the thing about Alcatel-Lucent is it gave them a huge fixed line and core business they didn't really have at all before as Nokia, and obviously there's less kind of room maybe for cuts. But then you had this overlap with mobile,
Bell Labs,
and I think actually that's really one of the reasons why they have had so many problems. It's not just duplication; it's trying to sort of sort all that out, almost distracted them on 5G. I mean, they've said that themselves. They've been quite clear about it, that they sort of took their eye off the ball while they were going through that process. And he's done, credit to Lundmark, I think he's done a really good job of this vision he has of it being sleeker, and he's split mobile out from the rest of the networks group. So you've got sort of fixed line and core separate from, fixed line and optical and IPs now separate from the mobile unit. You can sort of see what's going on more clearly. He's changed the way it reports.
And the fixed bit's doing all right, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the kind of the successful bit in terms of sales performance, really. And he's changed reporting lines. There's less of this this message that Suri had about end to end. You know, this sort of view that when you did deals, you kind of try to sell things together. I mean, it's just not. I mean, Lundmark pretty quickly said when he came in, that's just not the way people buy.
And it is an amazing thing to reflect back on, because the narrative at the time sort of made sense in terms of the simplicity of the buying process. You know, given that there is overlap in the Venn diagram between fixed and mobile with sort of backhaul and and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, you need fixed up to the base station, don't you?
Yeah, I think there is some. I mean, there's some of that, but I just don't think
they grossly overestimated what what I don't get is the failure in sort of strategic planning and market intelligence for them to assume that there was this demand which wasn't there. It just seems like a weird failure.
Well, I think one of the things Suri was saying was that if you go into a client and you manage to sell them, mobile products, then it's useful to have other things. You're in there, and then it's good. It's good. Once you've got a foot in the door, you can sort of sell them optical stuff as well, and to be able to offer both of them together is obviously going to appeal to some people. But on the other hand, I mean, Lundmark's saying that's generally not how it's done. That's one of the first things he said when he came in. And also, it's sort of slightly at odds with this whole message about operators not wanting to be over-reliant on one player.
Yes.
You're going to use your... I mean, it's interesting, KPN, I think, in the Netherlands, I remember talking to the CTO there. I mean, they're quite a small operator in a way, even though they're a national incumbent, because the Netherlands is a small market. I think they've got one mobile provider rather than two, for instance. But that makes it even more important for them to have a different company that's doing the fibre.
Yeah.
So in their case, I think they're still using Huawei on the radio side. It's quite a sort of outlier in terms of them going to that company and being more heavily involved with them, actually, in the last couple of years. But on fixed, it's all Nokia, yeah? And the CTO's thing is, we have to have that. That for him is vendor diversity, basically, not having one doing both, really. So I think there's some of the stuff that Suri was kind of, some of his strategy just didn't really make a lot of sense.
No. But it probably looked good on PowerPoint.
Yeah. I mean, apparently I don't know anything at all, because you were talking about...
Oh, right. You got...
So
you wrote up the quarterlies.
I wrote up the quarter. So I think the call was at 6:30 UK time with Lundmark. And then I had to go out for lunch, as you do, with another company.
Right.
So I think I had about an hour and a half to write it up.
Oh, this was yesterday, was it?
This was yesterday.
Yeah, right, of course.
So, and then this guy called Old Fecky, not Old Fucker.
He seems to be channeling that.
On Twitter, who's apparently a private investor, said, so he tweeted my story, went, headcount reductions mentioned as the only reason for Nokia's improved margin, and no mention of what's behind last year's still sluggish sales. Seriously, Ian Morris, Nokia's turnaround would deserve better analysis.
Oh.
I mean, easy Tiger. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't. It wasn't. You know, it wasn't meant to be a comprehensive sort of guide.
Well, it is
to
funny. I
Nokia,
mean,
but-
I know we shouldn't shirk any responsibilities.
Yeah.
But we exist within a certain strata of the information ecosystem. We're trade press. Your pieces tend to be longer and more in depth than my pieces.
Yeah.
But we're still trade press. We're not equity analysts. You're not paying us for our information.
Yeah.
We're not the various other ways in which you can get information. So I do find it a bit funny when they read something for free on one of our sites and then moan that they didn't get absolutely everything they wanted.
You can always do better analysis. I'm not sort of butthurt about it or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still the bit about the sales. I take a bit. I don't like being told by people that, oh, you've said this and you haven't explained it when you have, because it just suggests to me that they've not actually bothered to read the article properly.
Or they're setting up a straw man, or they've got a predetermined comment before they even read your piece.
We can come to the sales in a minute. I mean, his point about the margin issue, yeah, obviously it's not just headcount reductions. In fact, what they're doing is a lot of the money they're saving from headcount reductions, they say they want to reinvest in research and development, which is something that's gone down at Nokia under Suri. And I think that's one of the problems for them, really. When you've got Ericsson and Huawei spending quite a lot of money on 5G, and they were kind of cutting over all R&D, and there was a perception in the sort of investor community, perhaps, that they were taking their eye off that. So he wants to reinvest, and then you would get margin improvements just from having a more competitive product set. And
which is what Ericsson's done.
And obviously cost cutting isn't just about taking out staff. There's other things you can do as well to lower costs. But generally speaking, if a company's got flattish sales and their margins improve, it's because you've cut costs. It's not, I mean, it'd be nice if it sounds sexier than that, but that's pretty much the headline explanation. There's not any other way you can do it.
Yeah.
I mean, on the sales side, and this was, I mean, Pierre was commenting before we started that their share price actually went down on the day of this great reset they've had, and now is this sort of accelerated phase in growth. And yet their share price, I think, at noon in Helsinki on the day of the announcement was down about 4%.
Yeah.
So,
but it's been on a tear for about a year.
It has, and there's all sorts of reasons why. But I personally think there's still some questions over the sales performance, which was flattish. I think it was up a bit organically, but it was a bit worse than Ericsson. And if you look at the sort of moving, it's obviously a very different type of company in terms of what we talked about, all the fixed line optical stuff, the core network business.
But certainly like for like on mobile, we can compare.
Like for like on mobile. But if you look at the moving parts, I think fixed line is really soaring, and it has been for the last few quarters. I think it's been on a real tear, which is all to do with the pandemic really driving broadband traffic. Actually, it's actually fibre investment that's really driven that unit recently. Companies like BT, for instance, building out fibre to the home, and that's the sort of thing that's going on in other bits of Europe, other parts of the world.
Yeah, and we've had whole segments on the pod just talking about everyone's mad for fibre.
And who are you going to go to build your fibre network? Well, once you start to not want to use Chinese players, which cuts out ZTE and Huawei and smaller companies that are also involved in that, the only real scale player, I mean, the UK authorities have said this, is Nokia.
Yeah.
I mean, the issue maybe they've got is that there are smaller companies that are starting now to become more visible, like Adtran, Calix, could become a bigger threat. But it's just been it's been the kind of engine of growth for them for the last sort of 2 or 3 quarters, I think, that fixed line unit. If it hadn't been for that, then things would have been worse for them. And the problem really is still on the mobile side, where I think sales last year were down 7%. And the final quarter, they were down 13%.
Wow.
And as I say, you compare that to Ericsson, which is pretty much all mobile and slightly up on a constant currency basis. And you're thinking, well, what's going on here? And this is
so the
guy saying I didn't explain still sluggish sales. Well, I think I did. And the main
shut up.
The main reason for those, as I say, it's the mobile performance. Why is the mobile performance doing, not doing so well relative to peers? It's basically because of these problems they ran into when Siri was the boss. And we've talked about this loads of times on the pod before, but they just basically had a lot of 5G product difficulties stemming from, relying too heavily on one supplier, which was Intel, being let down there. having to then fall back on FPGAs, which are more expensive chips, which had an effect on margins, and then they've had to pivot away from that and introduce people like Marvel and Broadcom alongside Intel to try and get on top of it. But there's been this perception in the market that they're just not as competitive, basically, and not quite as good as.
And they've done a good job
Huawei.
of fixing that perception to some extent.
Well, I think they have, and when they came out with their big product refresh last year, and I had interviews with them at the time, and then I spoke with Gabriel Brown at Heavy Reading, who knows much more about these things than I do, and he was saying on paper it all looks absolutely fantastic, and it really looked like on a lot of these key metrics that operators are interested in, things like weight even of radio units, and how much bandwidth they can support.
Ericsson still likes to bang on about how light its radio units.
Yeah, and all sorts of other things, all sorts of other sort of detailed metrics. They really look like they'd nailed it, and it all looks good. And I'm sure. And the other thing is the FPGAs are being phased out. You look at the percentage now of products that include those, and it's relatively small. I think I don't want to get the figure wrong, but it's certainly less than it's in the minority basically of the products they're shipping, and it's all supposed to be finished, that job, by the end of this year, as I understand it. But I still don't hear glowing things about them in the kind of telco community, in the operator community. There still seems to be this. I'm still not sure that they've completely changed that perception that they are the number 3 player on a kind of technical ability front.
Yeah, and then I'm looking at their it was Nick Wood that wrote it up for us, and he put in one slide. It's funny sometimes when you I'm sure he would have done it or not anyway, but sometimes part of the job being an editor with freelancers is Nick and Mary they've been doing this longer than I have, so I'm not in a strong position to guide them, but I am still the editor. And anyway, when I was going to write it up, and then we have a little chat in the morning, and Nick and Mary pitch their stuff. And I normally, if they pitch something I'm going to write, I let them have it, because I only get a certain amount of their time, and I don't want them to spend too much of it looking for stuff. Yeah. And I can always just go off and write about fucking Joe Rogan or something. Anyway, so he grabbed it, and I just went, I often find the slide deck, the presentation for slide deck, quite useful, and I sent him a link to it, and then lo and behold, he took the hint and put a slide in, and his slide was headed, "Now we move on to accelerate and scale." Yeah. And so we got 4 columns: grow, invest, optimize, innovate. And it's a standard, fairly generic, PowerPointy stuff. So you've basically, you spent most of your analysis so far talking about their performance so far. Yeah. Which seems absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned. How do you feel about their sort of rhetoric about the next year or two?
I'm glad you asked, because they've got and maybe this is one of the reasons why investors are sceptical. They've got quite a ambitious growth target this year, an extra €1 billion in sales, which is basically implies growth of 5% year on year. And
what's the market sizing? Do you know? That's about 5%, isn't it? Or is it less?
Well, this is over across the whole portfolio.
Of course,
of
not
products.
just RAN. Yeah.
Now, I mean, what are you saying, that you're thinking mobile's going to go up 5%?
No, I genuinely don't know. I'm just wondering how their growth targets compare to anticipated growth of the overall market. Are they just going to match the market? Are they going to exceed the market?
What I would say, why I think there's a concern about that forecast and them achieving it is, I don't think. Arguably, there's not much more to be gained. I mean, fixed is motoring, and it will probably continue to motor this year. But even if they can achieve the same growth again on fixed, and as I say, the challenges there are really kind of, do companies start to worry about over-relying on Nokia? I mean, BT, for instance, has introduced Adtran alongside Huawei and Nokia, and you get the feeling that they might want to. They were clearly, UK regulators were worried about banning Huawei from the fixed line market simply because they didn't want to create a situation where Nokia is the only provider. And I just feel that there's maybe a desire among operators and even regulatory authorities to ensure that doesn't happen. And that's an opportunity then for companies like Calix and Adtran to come along and do something at at Nokia's expense. But
It
even
just
if
occurred to me, let me quickly butt in talking about Adtran. I wonder if they ever listen to this. We were talking about like potential guests. Ronan Kelly would be good to get on, wouldn't he?
he would, he'd be very good.
He's
yeah.
good. He's good at
Yeah.
chatting and talking shop.
But even if they can achieve that, they've got to sort of. A lot of the pressure seems to be on a lot of the pressure and attention is clearly on mobile. Which, as I say, went down 7% last year. That stems from market share losses that they had in not
US.
just China a little bit, but also mainly the US, where this big 5G contract went with Verizon went to Samsung rather than them. But you also hear talk of Ericsson sort of taking some market share from them in Europe and other countries, and they've probably done some. That we know they've actually done some deals at Huawei's expense for geopolitical reasons, but I don't hear that they've picked up much themselves because they're considered to be, the superior player to Ericsson ever.
Yeah.
And the trouble with the mobile side of things is it have they kind of missed the boat in a way?
5G boat.
Well, a lot of the deals have been done in the last 2 years, and the contracts have been signed. And they're left with a share of the market perhaps in some of these countries that isn't, and contracts for build out that isn't perhaps what they could have achieved.
Yeah.
And the other problem is that I think we've peaked. According to Omdia, we've peaked in terms of RAN spending for at least until the mid 2020s. Remy Pascal, who does the sort of market sizing for RAN spending. We often quote Del Oro, don't we, and talk about them, but let's do our colleagues a favour and sort of put some of their forecasts out there. And I won't come out the actual figures, but his numbers.
It's definitely Remy Pascal, not Pascal Remy. I always get that one wrong.
I think it's Remy Pascal.
Right.
He's gonna watch this and go, "Oh, you got my name wrong." But
Yeah.
but Omdia's
Pierre
figures are
wasn't just
basically that
looking at random
last.
stuff on his phone. He might be able to help us out with French names, but there we go.
Last year was the kind of high point for RAN spending and then he's basically got it dipping every year until 2025. And I think it's after going up a few percent last year, he's got it going down about 3% in 2022. So they're in a kind of market that's due to shrink a bit anyway.
So you're going, where's this 5% coming from?
I'm not saying they can't do it, but I think it requires them to have quite a strong mobile performance.
That is not the current trajectory.
That has not been happening, and I suppose you might say if you're looking at it from an optimistic point of view, you could say that for them maybe 2021's a low point. That a lot of the comparison's going to be favourable this year because 2021 was so bad. All those market share losses
and you'd think
have showed up.
they make these predictions based on some modelling of.
I'm sure
how things are going.
It's not like they don't know what they're doing.
They just pull
They're
numbers
just
out
going to pull numbers out their arse.
Well,
but
sometimes it does seem like that.
I think
not them, but companies in general.
The message. My headline was basically that after this reset phase, they really need to now show some growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they've done that in fixed, and that's not a question. That's a very, very successful, well-performing unit. But they haven't shown that in mobile yet. They really need to sort of start showing that they can grow in 5G. And the other concern is the enterprise unit a little bit. Enterprise for a long time with Nokia was the fast-growing bit. That is a growth driver. It's a very small growth driver. It's only about a billion, 1.5 billion maybe in sales, which in the context of a company that's making 22, 23 billion a year is small. But it was one of those sort of motors of growth. And then all of a sudden, last year, it's flat. It's just not really
right.
And the CEO himself said on the call, it's not met expectations. He didn't really provide a reason for that when he was asked. And they did say that the private wireless side of it's been doing very, very well. And
I still sometimes, when I try to visualise what enterprise means. Obviously, I think of things like private, like campus networks, that sort of thing. That makes sense. Is that a big part of it?
That's a big part of it. Sales to hyperscalers would be a part of it, which obviously isn't something that Ericsson's involved in.
And what do they sell to hyperscalers?
Well, they'd sell network equipment, wouldn't they? Optical stuff.
Right, for their data centres.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but and other products as well. But they're coming up against some companies like Cisco when they start to sort of sell some.
Yeah,
because and Juniper. But
we covered this when we were talking about Ericsson. The enterprise thing is an increasingly sort of persistent theme.
Yeah,
where it might not have been even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm still trying to work it out. I mean, 5 years ago, if we're talking about enterprise, we'd probably be talking about things like IoT.
Well,
and
I think
and that hasn't really come to much
it's still,
yet.
but IoT will be a part of it, of course.
But it hasn't really taken off, has it?
I mean, I think bits of it are taking off. I mean, if he's saying that private wireless is doing really well and they've got lots of new customers, which he was, it suggests there's a real slowdown in other areas. I can speculate why sales to hyperscalers or to, things that aren't private wireless, things on the fixed line side aren't doing so well. Possibly it's because some of those companies are building their own technologies. I mean, it's a bit like Amazon doing its own chips now. It's going to affect the people who sell chips, isn't it, if they start building them.
Totally.
And I think there's a bit of that going on. But it's a really competitive market. You've got other players in the mix there that you don't have in the... You talk about private wireless and who's Nokia's big contender. It's the same as it is in mobile macro, really. It's Ericsson, isn't it? Those are the two that are really kind of going after that. You've obviously got others trying to get in as well. It's more diverse and arguably there's a huge opportunity there, I think.
Well,
for some of
in
those small
fact,
companies,
this might be a good time, especially as we don't have tons of time.
Yeah.
As you talk about, firstly, fish me out a speckled hen from the Yeti if you can. Are they cold? The ice normally does a decent job. Are there ones right at the bottom?
That's cold. Feel it.
It's not that fucking cold. Have a little fish around the ones at the bottom.
Oh, dearie me.
There'll be colder ones. I know, I'm high maintenance. I'm worth it.
That's a cool one.
Can you feel how much colder that is?
Well, it just feels wetter, yeah.
It's a fine line. That is an order of magnitude colder, I'm afraid.
Right, okay.
I shouldn't have to explain these things to you.
We can't prove this to anybody on the pod, but...
So, you were talking about competition in macro, and that seems like some kind of segue.
Yeah, I think we've done Nokia to death now anyway,
into the next thing. So I'll briefly tee it up, but this is very much your story and your thing. But we chatted before, maybe in a pub after the last pod or something, I don't know, about... So in the pod we had with John Baker, he talked about CIPRI, and I got him to explain what CIPRI is. And CIPRI, I believe, is the sort of proprietary interface between the radio and the baseband. Yeah,
well, CIPRI is like where Open RAN all started, I think. Really.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I still think that's the main thing.
That's the main thing, and that's where I thought John explained it well, and we went into that. But there's another bit of technology or an interface or whatever. Anyway, I'll let you.
Well, there are quite a lot of them.
I'll let you correct. Let me say my thing, and then you can tell me how full of shit I am in my summary. That concerns how macro cells interact with each other, and that's called X2. And you've just written a fairly lengthy analytical piece on the implications of this X2 for. It seems to me, what I took from it is it seems to present another bottleneck in this otherwise open utopia that is being painted at Open RAN. But that's enough of my botching it.
That's certainly what Mavenir is saying, yeah.
Yeah.
X2, I'm not a technical expert, so...
Neither of us are. We're the blind leading the blind, but you're definitely less blind than I am.
And there are other things X2 does, but I think one of the main things it does, the simplest way to think about it is if you're driving along or even walking along and you go between two cell sites, the signal has to carry over between those sites.
Yeah.
It's no use if you cross that cell boundary and you lose the call.
As you put in your piece at the start, if you don't need to know that you've just been handed over from a Nokia to an Ericsson macro site.
Yeah, and if you're going from a Nokia to a Nokia cell site, which is often what's going to be happening because that's the way networks tend to be built. It's like clusters.
And you're only on one operator.
And then it's not an issue because their equipment interoperates because it's all from them. Where you need X2 is if you went from an Ericsson cell site to a Nokia cell site, basically. That's when
an Ericsson cell site to an Open RAN.
Or Ericsson to any vendor A to vendor B, basically. You walk across that line, and that's where X2 comes into play to make sure that handover is carried out. Now it's a 3GPP standard, and it's fully specified. It's not. So one of the issues with CIPRI, I mean, I don't think CIPRI is actually a 3GPP standard.
No, well, that's one of the things we covered.
3GPP.
It's all slightly woolly, isn't it?
It was done outside by Ericsson, Huawei, Nokia, and NEC are the people who own the IP.
NEC's been in the thick of this from day one, hasn't it?
Yeah, and
they just kept their head down.
And as I understand it, the problem with CIPRI is that it's sort of half finished. there's missing parameters there.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's like there's bits that are missing, which means you can't. It's not an open standard, basically. Really, it's something you implement, and then it becomes very hard for it to work with another vendor's gear.
I see.
So you use CIPRI.
Do we think that might be deliberate?
Well, I mean, that's clearly what the Open RAN community would
Yeah.
say. They would say that the whole thing about CIPRI is to make sure that when you buy your equipment, you have to get your radios from the same people that you get your baseband gear from.
It's all about creating sort of technological hurdles that make vendor lock-in a more
That's what they would
viable
say.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the Open RAN community's efforts have actually been. I know people talk about things like the RIC nowadays and software and all this stuff, and they say that's Open RAN. But to be honest with you, Open RAN, it all really started off. The idea was, wouldn't it be nice if you could go and buy your baseband products from a different vendor than you get your radios from, basically, and that required a more interoperable and open front haul standard than CIPRI, and it's actually called Open Front Haul, the one that this group, the ORAN Alliance, which is this alternative specifications group that was heavily backed by operators to try and deal with this sort of CIPRI issue, has this alternative now called Open Front Haul. And that's what you see being talked about when people talk about open.
So is
RAN
front haul another
deployments.
word for communicating between cell towers?
Front haul's the link between the baseband, like the compute processing stuff, and the radios.
Oh, so that's the CIPRI bit.
That's CIPRI.
Right. Okay. Cool. Sorry, I was getting the two things confused. Go on.
So when, for instance, Vodafone's deployment in the UK, 2,500 sites, this one that it's doing at the moment to replace Huawei, they would have, I think they're heavily reliant on Samsung actually for a lot of stuff, but one thing they want to use is NEC radios with Samsung's baseband products, which you wouldn't get in a traditional RAN.
Yeah.
You'd get Ericsson would do everything, say, or Nokia would do everything. X2 is different from CIPRI because it's a fully specified thing from the 3GPP. So it's all there, and it can be deployed as an open standard that allows you to build, in your network. You can have as we were saying, you can have a Nokia cell next to an Ericsson one.
Sounds good.
And people go across, and there's no
So the
problems
Open RAN
at all.
people must love it.
But there's a criticism from Mavenir, and it's actually started lobbying efforts now in the US about this, that X2 isn't often included in in equipment deals. Basically, it's either kept locked, or it's sort of the vendors will basically say, well, you can have it, but you have to pay high license fees for it, high costs.
So let me understand. Let me put this into sort of Scott language. So what you're basically saying is this thing that should be fully open, like, I don't know, a USB port on a computer or something like that.
I don't know if it should be fully open.
Well, it should be in so much as it's a 3GPP standardized thing.
Yeah. So
everyone should have equal access to the technology, and the patents should all be FRAND and all that sort of thing, yeah?
Yeah.
That's my understanding, perhaps in an excessively reductive way, of what things like
the
3GPP
use of the word
is all about.
The language they use in their filing with the FCC, because they're lobbying in America for this to be included in cell networks as something that's not licensed, and it's sort of mandatory. Yeah, X2. They want it. So if you go and build a network for an operator in the US, you'd have to include X2 in the build out, and it would have to be unlicensed. That's basically what they're asking for.
Which seems reasonable to me.
It does. Now, what I don't know, and the article was, it's quite a balance. It doesn't come down hard on one side or the other, because
proper journalism.
Because it's unclear. They say,
even though you clearly had Mavenir whispering in your ear while you were writing.
Yeah, well, not even whispering. Mavenir's argument is that, and they're quoted it in the article, and this is taken from FCC filings and stuff that John Baker said. Their argument is that operators are being almost held to ransom over X2. That vendors are asking for a huge amount to include an open X2 in the deployment, and therefore they can't. They're unable to pay for it, basically.
And we know Mavenir has an agenda, and that's fine. We don't hold it against them. Yeah. But allowing for that agenda and the fact that John Baker and co are going to tell you their side of the story. Yeah. Are you persuaded by their argument? Do you think that the authorities should intervene to make it a sort of standard thing.
It's a pretty nitty-gritty thing for the FCC to get involved in. And if I take the other angle...
It seems quite central to the whole Open RAN thing, isn't it?
Well, okay, so here's why it might not be as important as Mavenir thinks.
Right.
Or, I mean, even if you go along with the argument that operators are being fleeced and therefore they can't, use X2... And oh no, what an because then obviously Mavenir's position is, well, that makes it extremely hard to put new vendors into the mix, because they just wouldn't be able to interoperate with, if I try and take the other perspective, is X2 that important? The way networks tend to get built is that you assign one region to Ericsson, and then you assign another region to Huawei.
So it's not like on your own network you got one macro sells Ericsson, the other one's Nokia, the third one's
you
Open
don't
RAN.
intermingle base stations that way. It probably doesn't make sense commercially actually to do that.
That's taking vendor plurality.
This is even an argument for CIPRI. Does it make sense commercially to buy baseband equipment from a different provider than the radios? Is it something that now operators want? They say they want to do this. Some operators, but there's a question, and we talked about this a lot before. Vendor diversity. Would you necessarily want to do that and have lots of people in the mix?
The case to me seems to be unproven that it's superior. But even if hypothetically you did, let's say you'd set up a template for your macro cell, which was vendor A does this bit, vendor B does this bit, vendor C does this bit.
Yeah.
You're going to duplicate that template over all your macros, aren't you? So that's where the CIPRI thing and the X2 thing are different.
Yeah.
Because...
yes, totally.
Yeah, but to your point, you're still going to have the same vendor communicating with itself across macros.
Well, this is some of the feedback I had from operators who didn't want to go on the record with their comments, which is interesting in itself because that tells you maybe there is kind of an issue here, when people don't want to go on the record about something.
Yeah.
And also the vendors themselves who I asked to respond. I mean, Nokia and Huawei didn't respond. They sort of said they get comments and haven't. And Ericsson's they did supply a comment, but it was very sort of woolly comment about we can't comment on commercial arrangements.
Kind of dodging it. Except the people with an overt agenda like Mavenir.
And what I do know is that you can't take it for granted. This is where maybe Mavenir is onto something. You certainly cannot take it for granted that X2 will be included as a sort of free feature. It's obviously, from talking to operators, it obviously isn't. You can't take it for granted that it's going to be there as a kind of free, unlicensed feature. Now, whether vendors should be able to, look, licensing the word licensing sounds bad, doesn't it? Because as you said, the whole way that the 3GPP is supposed to work is on FRAND principles.
Yeah, but you still pay licenses. It's just that FRAND determines a fair rate.
Yeah. On the other hand, does that mean that vendors shouldn't be able to charge for X2 at all? I mean, if integrating X2 into
if it's their IP,
but
they don't just give it away.
No, but what I'm saying is that maybe there's a cost associated with X2. There's an integration cost associated with X2. And therefore, it might not be licensing fees even.
Yeah.
But the way that Mavenir might interpret any kind of expense that gets attached to it at all is that this is a license fee.
Yeah,
vendors do work for operators and charge them money for what they sell to them. They have to be able to make money out of what they're doing. You can't just expect them to come along and do something that requires any kind of effort at all and not do it for compensation. And that's where I'd be.
After all, we're not communists.
Yeah,
that's
but I mean, going back to the commercial point about this, the way that they build networks. If you've got a region of the country that's all Ericsson and then another region of the country that's all Nokia, you don't need X2 at all within that Ericsson cluster. The only place you would need it is actually on the border between where one meets the other.
Yeah.
And maybe that borders in an area of rural woodland where people don't really walk. You know what I mean? There's not a lot of people sort of moving from one cell to another. And even if you get a few dropped calls, it's not a massive issue.
That's all fair enough. But there's two things I can see there. The Mavenirs of this world don't want there to be any point of bottleneck or leverage or just control of the process by the legacy people. They don't want to have to go and ask them permission for anything.
Yeah.
Because if they do have to ask them permission, then in the great a negotiation, commercial negotiation, then those are some unique bargaining chips they have that may be used, may not be used. As you say, if it's just some forest on the border of England and Wales, who gives a toss except a few sheep?
Well, I tell you what, it'd be interesting to see how this plays out in the US, right? With this letter that they've sent basically to the FCC, and they had a meeting with what's her name, Jessica Rosenworcel, is it, the commissioner, in early January, and the FCC's parts of shouldn't say the FCC, but some American authorities are obviously very, very sympathetic towards Open RAN, aren't they? And want
more than sympathetic, cheerleading
Open RAN even, and want and see that as an opportunity.
Yeah, which is why Mavenir quite rightly thinks there's a sympathetic audience.
Exactly. So maybe if they can convince the FCC that having this thing mandated and not attaching any costs to it at all would allow alternatives and American alternatives at that as well to come along and enter networks more easily and compete against Ericsson and Samsung and Nokia, the kind of three big kit vendors that are there in the US market, then maybe the FCC is quite receptive to that message.
Yeah, and then
maybe we do see it being mandated.
Maybe it should be. This is a slight tangent, but still relevant. This is where it gets interesting for people, for sort of laissez-faire classical liberals like me, that would generally rather the market just ran its course. I constantly cite Adam Smith talking about cartels and monopolies. You do have to have regulation. You can't have a pure free market because there will always be vested interests that try and corrupt it.
Yeah,
and that's fine. That's just human nature. If I could find a way of charging you £2 to get into this room and you had to pay it, I'd fucking do it because we're all self-interested bastards. So I think Mavenir's right to appeal to a regulatory authority that wants to open up the RAN market as much as possible. You don't seem that sure, and I certainly haven't got a clue about the relative merits of the argument, but it seems like an argument worth making.
Yeah.
And I certainly think if X2 can be proven to be a thing that stands in the way of that is an obstacle in the rollout of Open RAN, then I would expect the FCC and the US state to try and do something about it.
Do you know where it might be useful? And this isn't from me, actually. This is from Gabriel Brown, heavy reading, because I spoke to him about it a bit. And he's quoted in the article saying that it might be useful so some of the stuff we were just talking about, private wireless and small cell deployments.
Yeah, which is one of the places we think pre-6G Open RAN might crop up.
Yeah, I think that will crop up there actually in a lot of markets. I think that, the Open RAN opportunity, the first opportunity for Open RAN is going to be doing actually what operators don't normally do and sticking a couple of base stations in the middle of another deployment, because they want to sort of enhance coverage there and capacity for a campus or whatever it might be. And then they're going to use a different provider because they want to give Open RAN a chance. They want to get new providers into the mix. And that's where you would need potentially
got to be able to speak to the other macros.
Yeah, if you want that to communicate with the macro and you want handover to be done, which isn't necessarily it might not be that you want handover or that you need it in an instance like that on a campus network, but it could be some of those deployments where we see a need for X2. It was Gabe was saying.
And again, I'd expect the likes of the FCC to be, if people could make a coherent argument that the X2 is standing in the way of that shit happening, then they might have a word. There's one other point, a bit of a tangent, but a story I wrote today just before I came out, not related to this directly, but yes, related to sort of regulation. And it slightly overlaps to the final segment as well. I don't know if that will form a segue, we'll see. But there are some laws going through the states that will basically limit the amount of control Apple and Google have over their App Store and the Play Store, respectively. So right now, let's use the App Store, but this applies fairly equally to both platform holders, of which there's a duopoly. Let's face it, you're not getting a phone that is neither Android or iOS.
Yeah.
Obviously, only losers get iOS. Actually, do you know what? Having said that, Pierre, I was talking about Rogan. Rogan had, I don't know if you've seen it. he had some guy on who's really obsessed with Google and all the little sneaky ways in which it can spy on you and all that kind of thing.
That's the last one or something, no?
It was relatively recent, yeah, because he's gone quiet for a week with all this fuss. Have you noticed that?
Apart from his little piece to camera on Instagram.
Apart from his, that's about the only thing he's put up on. He put that on Spotify as well. That's the only thing he's put on for a week. So he's obviously feeling the heat a little bit. Anyway, and this guy was just talking. He's a typical Rogan guest in that he's just got his one agenda, and he's like, Google's terrible. Google does this. Google does that. And Rogan, this is one of the things that antagonizes people like Rogan, but not me. Rogan just goes, shit, really? That's fucked up. Whereas people are usually looking for him to push back a little bit more, but that's not his MO. It's like being interviewed by Keanu Reeves or something. Yeah. He just goes, whoa.
Whoa, dude.
Whoa, no way.
Party on.
And yes, and for one of the first times I thought, shit, I bet you Apple's not as bad, because Apple's margins come from the hardware.
Yeah.
Whereas Google's margins come from you willingly accepting this spying device into your life and then it making money off your data. And that thing made me think, fucking hell. In that context, Apple's really preferable. Although what we don't know is maybe Apple, because it's not like everyone's going, Apple never wants more money. I mean, for all we know, Apple might be trying the selling your data game as well. I don't know.
No, they've had this massive push about privacy recently in the past 2-3 years. So
and one of the reasons they do it, I mean, the superficial reason they do it is because they want their customers to continue to trust them. But I think they also like the fact that it fucks up the likes of Google and Facebook as well.
I mean, did you see that Facebook said it was 10 billion they would lose?
It's losing 10 billion because of changes
but
on
they lost
iOS.
Like 220. So.
Oh, we're going to get to Facebook in a bit. Anyway, this thing, So basically, if you're, let's say we're talking about iOS, and you're an app developer. The most famous example of this is Epic that produces Fortnite, and so you got to, not only if you sell your app, let's say your app costs $5 on the App Store, you got to give Apple 30% of that. Okay, and that you're sort of like, all right, okay, they're the marketplace, they get to call the shots. 30% seems pretty harsh, if you ask me. But
that's the consequence of having a two-player market.
Well, exactly. Well, this is the point of.
If you're a small developer, it's 5% or something.
Well, they recently made some concessions. Anyway,
tiered.
But the point is, if Apple wanted to make it 90%, what the fuck could you do about it? Because it's a monopolist on its own platform. But then on top of that, they also don't let people, and this is what the Epic thing is about, more than the piece of the action of the cost of the app, they force people to use the Apple billing system for in-app purchases, which they then also charge them 30% of. So if your main thing, like most games, I don't know if you ever play any mobile games, I play some on my tablet, my iPad. They're normally designed to be these grinding games where it takes you ages to do anything, but you could spend money to make it all happen more quickly.
Yeah.
And if you say, I'm going to spend...
my son does that, and then I get requests every now and again. Dad, can I get these jewels for £5? And it's like, what are you buying? Actual jewels? No, it's just something on the game.
Yeah.
And it's like you're just buying
jewels to accelerate the game.
Like graphic.
Yeah, jewels are just in-game currency. And that £5 of that £5 that you spend on in-game currency for your son, 30% of that goes to Apple as well. And so basically the whole dev ecosystem's got the arsehole about this, but what can they do? And the interesting thing is that the US state is stepping in, and they're basically going to force them to open it up. Their counter argument, is to talk about safety and quality control and all that sort of thing, which probably has some validity.
Yeah.
But it's also a pretty fucking handy argument, isn't it? And the point I made in my story is if they're so worried about safety and quality control, they can always collaborate with third-party app stores to ensure that their app stores are nice and safe and high quality. Anyway, the reason I bring that up in the context of what we were talking about before is this is another example of where I approve of the state intervening in free markets, because in this case, the free market has evolved such that it's not free anymore, it's a monopoly. And you have to have regulators and the state intervening when a monopoly happens, even if it's happened for benign reasons. So it hasn't happened through M&A, it's only happened because Apple makes a superior product. But nonetheless, the monopoly's there.
Yeah.
Whether we like it or not. And then the state has to play catch up, because obviously Apple's had this monopoly for over a decade, and only now is the state going, oh shit, That's not great for the end user, and it's not great for the broader sort of mobile ecosystem. And Apple's not going to give it up willingly. But if I had to put money on it, I'd say eventually Apple's going to lose, and you will have competing app stores on iOS and the same on Android. Whether they'll be any good, whether the platform holders will seek to encumber them in some way, I don't know. But I think they're going to have that forced on them, which is interesting. Okay, so yeah, maybe that leads us on. Are we all right with the X2?
Yeah.
Maybe that leads us on to the final.
Nothing else to say on it, to be honest.
No, but I thought it was really interesting.
It is an interesting technical point, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes, I think, with the whole FCC thing and if anything comes of that. But
I think it will. I think as we're about to get into more, I think the US is leading the way. There are a few others. Occasionally you'll get someone like South Korea or Holland or whatever. But in terms of really big economies, the US is leading the way, funnily enough, against its own companies. Because it's realised that these big tech oligopolists have just got too much fucking power.
Yeah.
Now, my feeling is...
we
we kind of entered the last segment. I'm just kind of jumping the gun a bit, but I'm just going with the flow.
Wait, before we do...
Oh, right, yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to say the city of the month, actually.
Yeah.
It's New Southgate in England.
New Southgate.
Don't know what that is.
New Southgate, is that near us, mate?
I don't know.
Southgate's near us.
Yeah, that's
You
just
live there.
that's just central
it's
South
you
London.
downloading it loads of times in your little home.
That would be a lot. And then the second city
All his
is
mates. He goes around his mates. Going,
Yeah.
listen to this
I'll
pod.
give the podium, and then it's Sarasota, and then San Francisco.
Right,
There you
all
go.
the S's.
Oh, nice.
Sarasota, that's California as well, isn't it?
San
Florida.
Francisco.
Oh, no, that's Florida. It's Panhandle.
Sarasota.
I should have known that.
Florida.
Yeah, I think it's up
Oh, right,
isn't it
right,
up in the Panhandle, the top bit of Florida?
The Redneck Riviera.
Redneck Riviera. My granddad used to live in Tallahassee. How dare you?
Tallahassee.
I like the word Tallahassee. It's a great word.
It's a proper American word, isn't it?
No, that's Native American.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, even more so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Damn right.
Oh, wait.
Oh, sorry, you got
No,
more.
I'm
more
double
things to
checking
say.
what I'm saying. It's,
Yeah, you
it's
might
on the
want to
other
double
side.
check that before you butt
It's
it
the
in.
back of the penis.
Oh, okay,
the
so that's
Gulf.
more Tampa. It's Tampa rather than
It's
Panhandle.
between Tampa and Fort Myers. Yeah.
Yeah. Back of the penis. for
It
God's
does
sake.
look like
So it's not really the
But
Panhandle.
when you look at it in isolation, like you did there,
but even like it does look like sort of glands hanging down, doesn't it?
God, don't start getting more anatomical, for God's sake. And Georgia's sort of the balls.
It's the pecker.
Now
God's
that you
sake.
said that, I'm never going to get that image of Florida out of my mind.
Yeah.
It's a pretty common image. Yeah.
Well, my dad used to live in Miami, which I suppose is the bell end. So there we go.
Is that what it's called? That's a nickname for Miami.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into what the Florida Keys are. Okay, exactly. Where were we? See, now I've forgotten. I was just doing a cunning segue, and you fucked it up with all your geographic cock talk. We were talking about big tech, and basically, they're so big, they've got so much influence. The digital economy is so central. Our day jobs are all digital economy. We only publish digitally. We don't have print. This podcast is only accessed digitally. It's not broadcast. So the digital economy is just sort of everything, really. I mean, I know you still walk down the road and there's people digging holes in the road and posting letters.
I hate that expression, digital economy.
Why?
I just don't like the word digital.
No, it's definitely overused. Digital.
I mean, we need to come up with a new word to describe.
Cyber.
It just
Cyber?
means internet. Or cyber's better than digital. I mean, digital is Dean Bubley's like that. Actually, he gets irritated by that.
No,
word.
I
It's just
have
a
sympathy with
rubbish
both of you
word.
on that.
digital
It's
fingers.
very hackneyed, overused.
It's fingers.
Digital,
Well, yeah,
digital happened
technically
a long,
digital is
a long
fingers.
time ago when you start to get digital watches and stuff. You know?
I agree. But I use it to be distinct from analog, i.e. to be distinct from real, tangible things. This table is an analog thing. Telecoms.com is a digital thing. You can't touch Telecoms.com. So you're just going to have to fucking live with that, aren't you?
It's meta.
That's another one.
So we got the digital economy, and it's basically dominated by very few people. Either people who dominate the front end, the consumer-facing end, like Apple and Google and Facebook, as we're about to come to a decreasing extent, or those who dominate the back end, which is also Google. I suppose the front end and the back end, so you could say Amazon is massively, I should have mentioned them in the front end because, of course, we buy most of our shit off Amazon, at least I do. My Amazon bill every month alone is just silly. And then I probably don't spend that much money on Google, but I probably spend a lot more time on it because I use Chrome, I've got an Android phone, I use Gmail. You know, the amount of time I actually interact with Google's servers is far greater with Amazon. But then maybe not.
It's the search engine you use, I'm assuming.
Say it again?
It's the search engine you use. You don't use
Yeah,
Bing?
exactly. I use Google. I've got to start with, that was my point about the iOS earlier. I've got to start weaning myself off. I've even got a Pixel phone. For all I know, buying a Pixel phone is even more spy than getting like a Galaxy S, whatever we're on now. Even though that's an Android phone, because this is Google's own brand, so it's probably got extra Google special sauce in it. Anyway, but what are my alternatives? And the same goes in the infrastructure. We've got these three, which leads me eventually meanderingly onto the final core of the final segment, which is the quarterlies for the hyperscalers, especially the public cloud giants. They all kicked ass. They all knocked it out of the park. Today, Andrew wrote up Amazon's numbers, and Amazon retail was pretty shit, but the AWS continues to go through the roof.
Yeah.
And basically, not only is it all of its profit, but the retail thing's making a loss. So it was like the net profit for the whole group was something like $3.5 billion, of which AWS made $5 billion.
Yeah,
so the retail bit was lost $1.5 billion.
The profit margin on...
you covered it, didn't you?
I did. The profit margin on AWS is 30%, and for the whole of Amazon it's 10%, which tells you something. And what did I can't remember what their net profit was, actually, Amazon, but I know it doubled.
But all because of AWS.
And it was AWS driving growth.
And as Andrew put in his...
Do you know where a lot of it comes from?
Go on.
Facebook.
Right. As a client.
As a client.
Yeah,
because apparently they've done a big deal with them for the metaverse.
Right.
To be the public cloud provider for the metaverse and do sort of AI stuff in the background. And so if you're on that if you're living in Facebook's metaverse in future, you've got Amazon there as well, sort of powering things.
God.
I mean,
you see what I mean?
What an uplifting thought.
Well, this is my point. There's not many of them. I mean, for a little while they used this acronym FANG with two A's. And I always used to joke they only put in Netflix so it didn't turn into a abbreviation and get you in trouble.
Netflix isn't really big tech, I don't think.
No, it's its own thing.
It's market cap something like 250
billion. And it's not diversified. It does one thing. It does SVOD. Yeah, that's it.
They did start like video games now, so it's a bit of.
They're trying to diversify.
Lots of people are trying cloud gaming and failing.
They're not doing a great job of it, I don't think. They're still a bit of a one-trick pony, aren't they?
Yeah.
But so Amazon.
Is it too late though?
Amazon, thanks to the public cloud, kicking ass. Google, yes, it's doing great on its normal stuff as well, but its cloud was outgrowing the rest of Google, I believe.
Yeah.
And the same goes for Microsoft.
Well, that's the one that's really motored.
Right.
So there's a research group called Synergy Research. I don't know if you know them, but
rings a vague bell.
They track public cloud basically and the market shares of the main players. Now, anybody who says that the hyperscalers aren't dominant in that area and that there's other public cloud options should take a look at their data since 2017.
Right.
Because what's basically happened is Amazon's got about a third of the market, it's about 33%, and it's just stayed like that over the last few years since 2017. This is a growing market, by the way.
Of course, yeah.
So if
Massively
you stay at 33%, you get a lot more revenue anyway. Microsoft's gone up from about 10% in 2017 to 21% of the market.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And Google's also gone up, although less sort of dramatically.
So they've been 10%. Eating into the long tail?
They've been eating into the long tail. Right. So all the others and IBM, the only other ones that have grown are the Chinese players, yeah? You look at
but they've
like
probably
Alibaba.
Got their own sort of guaranteed market.
Well, exactly. But you look at the others, because the way Synergy does its graphs is it shows the big three, and then it shows Alibaba, and it shows IBM, and then it shows others, and others is like that.
Yeah.
And IBM's like that as well.
Right.
And they're just...
And Oracle and all that. None of them are.
Well, Oracle will be included in the others, but I just find it interesting that The Economist writes a lot of articles going on about, we shouldn't worry too much about the public cloud because it's not as consolidated as everybody thinks, and there's actually quite a lot of options. Well, that's total bullshit, I'm afraid.
Define consolidated.
I mean, that market is all about scale. The reason people use the word hyperscaler, which is a horrid word, is because scale is crucial in that public cloud market, and nobody can afford to compete anymore, actually. This is the other interesting thing. For the first time ever, Amazon broke out the details of its capital expenditure. Where does the money go? So last year, I mean, talk about ridiculous amounts of capex. 60 billion they spent last year in capital expenditure. 24 billion of that was on data centers and IT infrastructure. It's more than they spent on transport, or it was the big one. It was basically the biggest item.
Yeah. Yes, on those.
More than they spent on warehouses.
Have you noticed how sometimes Amazon shit comes in the completely the wrong size box?
Yeah, it's like enormous box and full of like, brown
full
paper.
Full of that scrumpled up paper, and then you just got one little thing in there, one little ink cartridge or something. Yeah, I mean, totally.
And then you look at the list of companies that they've done deal with in the last quarter. If you worry about dependency on the public cloud, and this comes after they've had outages, and people are now starting to talk more about is it all that sensible? People in telecom are saying, is it all that sensible?
Yeah, which we've been saying for ages.
Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, Best Buy, Facebook, United Airlines. They're massive companies basically doing cloud deals with AWS in the last quarter alone.
Yeah, they're all doing it. Do you know what?
Yeah,
I watched. I was a bit ill earlier on in the week, and so I had a couple of days where, thank God Andrew's here, where I was just like, I was basically most of the day in bed, but with my laptop just in case the shit hit the fan.
This wasn't like coronavirus thing.
No, I think was food poisoning.
Oh yeah.
So
Details, please.
I'll just leave that there.
Yeah.
And one day when I was lying in bed, I thought, I want to watch something on telly. And I fired up The Big Short.
Oh, that's a good film, yeah.
And I'd never seen the film. I'd read the book.
Yeah.
And if, you've read my book, and all those bits where I've got those obscene acronyms of those derivatives, that's all very inspired by Michael Lewis's book. And
so good.
And all the other accounting people like Matt Taibbi, all the other people that covered the subprime crisis. But I'd never seen the film, and I've got to say, I think they did a fucking good job on that film.
Yeah, it's good.
It was really good. I mean, obviously, it being dramatised, there are lots of corners cut, but I thought they kept in just enough of the granular, arcane detail, while still making it dramatic, and it was cool and stylish as well. Really well done.
I love the scene where it's like, wait, say that again.
Yeah, and then occasionally they'll pan to Selena Gomez explaining some bizarre little sort of financial thing.
Like,
I thought those were great little touches.
She was in it even.
Yeah, well, she was just doing one of those little monologue explaining
Brad Pitt
bits.
looking very professorial.
Anthony Bourdain as well.
Oh, what was the best bit? Where they had, what's that really?
Margot Robbie.
Yeah, Margot Robbie. And they had her in a bubble bath, drinking champagne, basically being a diva. And she explained all this stuff, with bubbles just covering up her top and all that sort of thing. And then at the end of it, she goes, right, now fuck off. I thought that was brilliant. Anyway, it's all stylish done. But the reason I mention it is a lot of the underlying story behind the subprime crisis and The Big Short and all that sort of thing is the economy, people putting all their eggs in one basket, people taking excessive punts in one direction, a lack of hedging, a lack of balanced portfolios. Everyone just went all in. You got this speculative frenzy. No, I'm not saying
passing the hot potato was also.
Well, there's that as well.
That's not my problem.
And the comparisons with this, don't stand up to too much scrutiny. But there's just a sort of visceral feeling, especially the all your eggs in one basket thing. It's the lack of redundancy. It's that if it does go wrong, and I'm sure it won't. I'm sure we'll all be fine. But if it does go wrong, what alternatives do we have?
Yeah. And that's the massive, and this is, I mean, drawing it back to telecom a bit, because obviously public cloud isn't specifically a telecom thing, but when we write about it, a lot of the time it's about these deals where they're doing signing contracts with telecom service providers like Deutsche Telekom or BT or whoever it might be, to put IT resources in the public cloud, or even put your network functions in the public cloud, which is this big theme and actually ties in with Open RAN and a lot of the other stuff. And you do see, I actually think it's encouraging that you see signs of resistance to that coming. These big deals that got done with last year with Dish deciding that it's going to stick everything it possibly can into AWS,
including taking out the bins,
and to hell with the consequences. And then AT&T, maybe even more dramatically, because that's a brownfield operator with a huge customer base already, saying it's going to run its 5G network through the cloud.
AT&T, which used to be one of the biggest producers of its own intellectual property and R&D, has now just sort of gone, fuck it, we'll let Amazon do it.
Yeah, and the thing I thought was really funny, when I've written about this a couple of times, is when AWS had that massive outage, remember last year? Everybody was waiting for an AWS outage because Facebook had gone down, not a public cloud obviously, but it had problems. Then AWS went, and then Neil McRae at BT put that tweet up saying, still want to put your core network in the public cloud, suckers, which was just... Although, it sums it up, really.
It does, although Neil McRae's going to look like a bit of a twat if BT does then go all in on the public cloud.
That's the thing, isn't it? But I guess with their chief architect, and you'd think that he's not going to say that unless he's pretty sure the CTO's thinking.
Well, for now, but things change. I mean, at the time he wrote it, I'm sure it was completely...
I wonder if it will change. I think it's more likely that... I do see signs of a backlash now coming against, or at least if you're going to... I mean, these all-in deals that people have done, like AT&T and Dish. And it was interesting because we were at that Vodafone dinner when they were talking about the software investment they're making. And part of that is to do with actually not being dependent on the public cloud and being able to move things around.
To be autonomous costs money.
Yeah, it does. That's the trade-off. This is the thing. Does it, economically, does it make sense?
That's why I often frame it as a Faustian pact. You're achieving not just cost efficiencies, but also all the tools and added value that we concede these people bring. But it's at a cost. There's a trade-off.
These companies must have loved it, this pandemic, really. The last 2 years of mayhem, when companies have been, not only has it been more important than ever to be digital, and to let employees work from home and to have, a sort of cloud capability and all that stuff, which has actually spurred investment in the cloud itself, but also all the problems that it's brought economically for people like United Airlines and whatever.
And for the long tail, the consolidation it's caused.
Yeah, and what are they thinking? Cost cutting is now top priority for hundreds of organisations.
Why didn't we, Ian, 2 years ago, given that we know a thing or two, why didn't we just remortgage a house and just blow the lot on Google, Amazon and Microsoft shares?
We should have done.
We'd be laughing now.
2 years ago, if you'd done that, you'd have been...
We'd be like Margot Robbie, and we'd be next to Margot Robbie in that
bubble
bathtub.
Bath. That's a nice thought. I'll make sure Magda doesn't watch this bit.
Yeah. Nice thought for other people, not me. Definitely not. I mean, in hindsight, that was obviously the smart investment. I was sniffing around. I wasn't investing much, a few £100. But, I was thinking things that had really fallen off a cliff, like cruise liners and that sort of thing. But in hindsight, the smart move was tech hyperscalers.
Yeah.
I got Marriott's.
Yeah? Has that done well?
It's up 50%.
From 2 years ago?
From when, late March 2020, yeah.
Marriott.
2 years ago, basically.
Yeah.
The hotel chain.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I've got ones that I've already sold out of that were up about 200%.
Well, it's bounced back recently, I'm guessing.
No,
because people
steady recovery.
Yeah.
Right.
No, there have been some much more volatile ones. But
Peloton.
Chip stocks.
Peloton's just gone down the toilet, hasn't it?
Chip stocks have been good to invest in.
Yeah, well, that's before we even knew there was going to be
Nvidia was an insane.
They're all like that. Marvel's like that as well.
Because remember,
Nvidia's done especially well.
Bitcoin went on a tear, and so did crypto mining, and so did Nvidia. Like insane.
A lot of them, Xilinx, I think, Marvel certainly is
but Nvidia's particularly good at parallel processing, which is particularly important for intensive functions like crypto mining.
Hashing. Let me have a look, actually.
Yeah.
Well, it's all GPUs, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Back to the original point, and then we'll get on and conclude on Facebook, because we've only got about sort of 10 minutes or so left. They're all kicking ass, and they're increasingly kicking ass because of public cloud. And back to the thing we were talking about before with regulation, all that sort of thing. Good luck to them. They deserve it. I mean, Jeff Bezos created a website where you can buy books over the internet, and then 20 years later...
I wonder what book you can buy on Amazon, actually, Scott.
Well, there's a particularly good one called Identity Crisis, written by a promising new author. Anyway, yes, you can buy that. Not many fucking people are, though. Come on.
I did.
Come on, fan base. Yeah, you still haven't reviewed it, though.
That's true. I still haven't reviewed it.
Every time you bring it up, I bet you regret bringing it up because I give you a guilt trip about reviewing it. Okay. You can join all the other reviews that are mates of mine who I've forced to write nice reviews. But yeah, so he started up selling physical books at the time. Obviously, Kindle and shit didn't exist then. And then he suddenly just basically invented this public cloud market.
Yeah.
And so fair play, he deserves it. I'm never going to diss people like that. There was a little thing, I don't know if you ever saw this on social media. Rogan covered it once recently where Bezos was at some party, at some disco party, and he was just looking cool. He was wearing cool sunglasses. He had a beautiful woman, his arm around a beautiful woman. He's ripped. He's obviously been down the gym. And obviously the internet was all just like, you twat. And Rogan was just like, fair play to the bloke. I mean,
yeah.
Bezos deserves everything.
His point was like, what is he supposed to do with 200 billion?
Do you know what I mean?
What is he supposed to do?
Well, go create
the
phallic
latest thing I
rockets for
heard
starters.
is that in Rotterdam, he's building his mega yacht, and they had to move like a bridge.
The bridge. I even mentioned it in my story write-up today. They've had to remove this old bridge in Rotterdam, and apparently it's only just been renovated, and they were told that it wouldn't be removed for years. And the worry is obviously that it's going to take ages to reassemble it. And
can I say that?
Just for
Jeff Bezos
yacht.
to put his big phallic helicopter landing pad on it, yacht,
of course,
super yacht down this.
It's like Succession. I've seen the video, and I don't. I mean, the yacht doesn't look that big, actually. I expected something much bigger.
It's too big for this bloody bridge anyway.
Yeah.
It's a good metaphor for Amazon and the way it's trampled through various sectors.
It is. It has. But the point I'm trying to make, it has trampled, and I'm not saying it's not time to rein it in.
What is it? Creative destruction, but sometimes maybe it is just destruction. I don't know from some people's perspective.
Well, it's created a yacht for Jeff Bezos.
It's created an overly powerful company. I mean, I don't have anything against Jeff Bezos personally, and I think a lot of that stuff that you were talking about with, the Joe Rogan and the images, it's just people don't like, people envy successful people.
Yeah, but it feels like they're having their nose rubbed.
But I don't, it's becoming monopolistic.
Well, exactly.
That's the problem.
So this is the point, and this is what I was leading up to. I think fair play. He's got there on merit. He's done something better than everyone else. As a free marketeer, I can't have any sour grapes, but there comes a point, back to the Adam Smith thing I'm always banging on about, there comes a point now where we've basically got, I don't think Apple so much counts, except for in the context of the App Store thing I was talking about
Apple's
earlier.
Far less worry. I mean,
because Apple's a contained thing. You either buy a Mac or an iPhone or you don't.
Yeah.
Their tentacles don't reach into too many other things. I mean, you could argue that for a while they were distorting the digital audio market, but then Spotify's come along there.
You could spend your entire life not giving them a dime.
Yeah. You could. It's a more of a walled garden type of scenario with Apple, but I'd say that the big two are Amazon and Google. Microsoft's up there, but even Microsoft, a lot of its legacy money is from stuff that we know is ubiquitous, Windows, but we sort of know where that is.
Well, isn't Microsoft the most valuable company though? Out of the
they're always trading places.
Apple and Microsoft, isn't it?
Apple and Microsoft are up there in
Amazon's
trillion valuation.
Quite a bit less.
Yeah, it is.
It's under 2
It
trillion.
is, but I'm not talking about market cap. I'm talking about their effect on everyone's lives.
Yeah.
And I think Amazon's right up there. I think it has a bigger effect on everyone's life than Apple.
We should talk about Facebook before we sign off completely because
we do. I'm leading up to that. So my point is, those three are really big, and they're making tons of money. This is one of the reasons I don't get to Facebook, by the way.
So currently, it's Apple, and then Microsoft, and then Google is fourth, and number 3 is Saudi Aramco.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So I need. It's funny. The oil ones used to be the top, and then they slipped down, and they're sort of bouncing back again because of all the energy issues.
It does make you grateful that we're covering this sector. I know we're sort of adjacent rather than right in the middle of it, but it's not. We're covering the biggest sector in the fucking world.
Yeah.
Apple is nearly 3 trillion now.
Which one is? Apple.
Microsoft is 2.3.
Mm.
Half a trillion.
I think Apple's overvalued. I just find it astonishing that it's worth.
But the fundamentals
$3 trillion.
are it's a money making machine.
It's the VR. The stock is at a high because of the VR outlook and the car potentially.
Well, also
Really?
Apple's
Yeah.
Apple's
really
doing a
think it's going to do something in those areas?
Oh, the
I mean,
VR headset is very much in the works.
Yeah,
And
it
it's
might
gonna
be in
be
the
the-
works,
it's
but
gonna be
Tim
the
Cook
best.
hasn't done anything apart from the iPhone. More
So I'll tell you in
iPhones.
terms of fundamentals why it's still a growth, because it's I think revenue and margin from devices are sort of plateaued,
Yeah.
but they have done a really good gradual, and I will take this opportunity to go into Facebook, strategic pivot towards services.
They have, but they still get most of their money from the iPhone.
But an increasing proportion
Yeah.
is from services, and I think that's where when you think
But-
about
but
how investors
You
think.
yourself have said that those services are tied to the iPhone. You
The
know,
install base, yeah.
It's installed
the
base,
captive market, yeah, totally.
So they have to sell hardware to be able to. You know,
Yes.
Their model is to actually have a walled garden, isn't it? That's
Totally.
what Apple's all about.
Totally,
So-
which is what this US legislation is trying to fuck with.
Yeah.
But they continue to sell. It's just that the growth, which is what tends to drive up share prices, anticipated future growth, is coming more from the, dare I say it, digital side of things than
Digital.
than the
That word again.
devices. Anyway, let's finally get to Facebook, because the contrasting thing, and the reason why Facebook should not be spoken about in the same breath as these other 3 or 4 companies.
It's worth less than $1 trillion for a start.
Well, certainly as of this week.
It's worth about 600 billion. I
Yeah,
think, at
because
the
it had
moment.
its quarterlies,
Yeah.
and immediately its share price went down about 20%, and then I think since then it's gone
I think
down.
There's nearly 300 billion wiped off the
Yeah,
market cap.
that's the official
Yeah.
term. You got to say wiped off. You can't say
What-
removed.
Wiped is the word.
Wiped.
I actually didn't use it in the story because you told me that
Yeah,
everybody uses wiped.
because I'm being such a
And then I
pedant
thought I
about
have to
it.
write. I was thinking I'll write wiped. I know Scott always says everybody uses the word wiped. So
They
but
do.
you
I
are-
challenge you to find
you
any
are right.
media that
I've
talks
done it,
about.
I've done it dozens of times.
Yeah. Any media that talks about share price decline will always talk about wiped off.
Yeah.
The other thing, apart from the cliche, which is fine, we all use cliches. The other thing that annoys me about it is the way they try and frame it is that money is that like a bunch of banknotes being put in a skip and set on fire.
Yeah.
You know, it's just digital.
Like the KLF,
I'm afraid it's just conceptual. You know, tomorrow, what's the opposite of wiped? Unwiped?
Yeah.
That's not great imagery.
Birthed.
Yeah. So what if it goes up by the same amount again the next day? What, you know? So the money's just conceptual. Anyway, but I don't think it is in the case of Facebook. I think they are in terms of falling from their peak. I think they're kind of fucked. I mean, they're not properly fucked. You know, they still own Instagram. They still own WhatsApp. They're still investing loads of money in VR and metaverse. And
Metaverse,
all
all
that
of it's
sort of
going
thing.
in. That's why their profits were down. A lot of metaverse investments.
Well, exactly. So their problem is, I think the reason their shares were down so much is they revealed a sort of peak in terms of the metrics they use, DAUs and MAUs, which is daily average.
Users was down.
Yeah, daily users and monthly users. It wasn't so much down. The BBC, me and Andrew were chatting about this. BBC basically drilled down into numbers and they found a tiny increment where it's down about 0.001%. It's basically plateauing, but it's perfectly reasonable to extrapolate that plateau to then be a sine wave that then starts going down.
Even that 0.0 point whatever
Yeah,
it
it's
is,
still
it's still the first time ever, I think.
Yeah. So it's an inflection point, definitely. So basically, Facebook itself is starting to decline, and we've got every reason to assume it will be, because my kids wouldn't know Facebook if it bit them on the arse.
Yeah, I think the trouble with that market is like things like Google and with its search engines, it's a very hard thing to disrupt. You get this sort of network effect, as that they call it. It's a fancy word, isn't it? A fancy expression, where the more people that use it, the more beneficial it becomes, and then it becomes very hard to sort of wrench yourself out of that. And the hyperscalers are just hard to challenge because they have hyperscale, and then it's almost like an entrenched monopoly, and the spending that is required to set up all those data centers isn't something that a company can easily come along and do. Whereas social networks, I mean, we've seen this before, never one so big struggling, but social networks have failed in the past. You know, people who are out, teens who are out skateboarding don't want to hang around in the same online community as crusty oldsters.
Well, I think Zuckerberg explicitly said that TikTok's kind of fucking him over. Those weren't his precise words.
Yeah.
But
this is why in the past they've tried to buy people, have bought people like Instagram.
Yeah. Imagine if they hadn't bought Instagram Instagram, WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And actually regulators are trying to retrospectively undo those
Yeah.
acquisitions.
Yeah.
Even that bit of M&A, they'll probably leave them alone now. They go, poor fuckers, we'll let them have that. So there's that. And then the sort of what Zuckerberg and co are asking investors to believe in is their strategic pivot to the metaverse. Now, unlike, for example, Apple's very graduate strategic introduction of services as a bigger piece of the pie, this feels like a more absolute pivot.
Well, they're deciding people want to live in a virtual reality, gaming, social interaction.
Leaving aside, I mean, we'll get onto that. I share your skepticism of that, but it's the severity of the move. It's basically saying all this stuff that's got us where we are, that's declining.
Yeah.
And now we're going to move to this whole new thing that, as you say, so you're skeptical, I'm skeptical. Yeah, I'm 50. Maybe it's not aiming at me. Maybe it's aiming at my kids. But, my kids have a few times have asked for VR headsets. I don't get any indication that, like Jack's 17, he's going to be 18 in May. He still wants to go and hang out, go with his mates to the pub, hang out with girls, just do normal fucking teenage shit. He doesn't want to have a VR headset strapped to his face the whole day.
Maybe he can do all that in the metaverse, and he wouldn't even know any different.
But I think human beings will never
stop. Maybe we're
stop.
already in the metaverse now.
Oh, that's all that Matrix stuff.
Yeah.
I think human beings will never stop wanting to do normal stuff.
Yeah.
And you can't... This is, again, back to your digital bugbear. Zuckerberg is basically trying to say everything will be digital. Analog, no more. You'll just be a brain in the jar.
In the metaverse, maybe you can go and share a bubble bath with Margot Robbie.
You could, but how many times could you do it without thinking, what a kind of a tragic prick am I? Creating this VR Margot Robbie experience for myself.
Apparently last year the virtual, virtual real estate market hit 500 million last year. There's been $500 million spent on virtual real estate.
Yeah, and then you got NFTs and all that sort of thing, and it all feels quite bubbly. Having said that, our good friends at CC Group, I noticed I'm friends with Foggy on Facebook. I noticed they've set up a new section of their thing to do with Web3, and they even had a little section. He published it, so I presume it's all right for me to mention it. Sorry if it's not. But Private Eye took the piss out of it because it was taking the piss out of the buzzwordiness of it.
Right.
And Private Eye, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's good to be taken the piss out of by Private Eye.
Well, exactly. Which is why I think Rich made the point, about there's no such thing as bad publicity and all that.
That's great.
And it is. I mean, Web3 is very ill-defined, but a lot of it is to do with this sort of blockchain, decentralized, parallel alternative world and economy. Fuck knows. No one really knows what's going on. But, fair play. Get in early on a buzzword and see where it takes you.
Totally.
So anyway, Facebook's basically having a massive punt on Web3, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
And
the metaverse.
And I'm not surprised, but it includes, blockchain, NFTs, all this stuff that needs to exist to make the metaverse more than just like Second Life from 20 years ago or whenever it was. You need to be able to buy and sell real estate, like Pierre was saying.
But skeptics who will always dredge up Second Life and say, "Oh, that's a good reason why it's not going to work." But I don't think it's a valid comparison, really, because it's almost like looking at the first .com crash. There was a lot of talk then about, people don't want to use some of these websites and they don't want to buy things online. And there was all this chatter going around when a lot of those companies failed, and actually they did. It's just like
just a speculative bubble.
Well, it just wasn't. There were all sorts of reasons. The broadband capacity wasn't there actually to use websites well.
The mobile internet wasn't there.
The mobile internet wasn't there. The ecosystem hadn't developed enough. It's almost like the phone situation. 3G came along and everybody's like, nobody wants to look at the internet on their phone.
No,
well, actually, they live on the internet on their phone nowadays. It's just that the phones weren't good enough. The network wasn't good enough. All these the Second Life things, I think, it's a spurious comparison, I think, because
but the reason I made the point is that the Web3, my limited understanding of it is Web3 is what turns Second Life into the metaverse as it's envisaged now. It basically gives it a skeleton, it gives it an infrastructure, whereas previously it was a very much one-dimensional thing. But now you can actually Now you can actually buy and sell things and live a supposedly full, although I'll question full, a supposedly full existence in this metaverse, thanks to things like NFTs and blockchain and all
Look,
that.
as long
jazz.
as you can have a bubble bath with Margot Robbie, people are going to go for it. Yeah?
I think that's as good a point as any to end the podcast. To be honest, we'll leave that there, without making a mental note not to bring that up again, or you would just obsess about it in the next podcast. Cool. All right, jolly good, because Pierre's got shit to do in 5 minutes anyway. So we will wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.